All right, Chris, would you like to get started?
Great, yes. Thank you everybody for joining today's webinar. It's so great to see so many faces. My name is Chris Wilke. I'm the Global Advocacy Manager at Waterkeeper Alliance. And I have the great pleasure of working with the Break Free from Plastics Coalition on so many initiatives relating to better management and reduction of plastics in the world, which are so polluting in so many aspects. And we are in for a real treat today for a couple of reasons. First of all, we have two amazing leaders from the Break Free from Plastics movement, and we're going to hear from them directly. But specifically, they have both been working very, very hard on a very important initiative to create a global treaty on plastic pollution, and it is moving forward, which is so exciting. And I don't want to steal any of their fire, so I won't describe that process in any event because I want you to hear directly from them. But we are going to be hearing from Jane Patton, who is the campaign manager for plastics and petrochemicals at Center for International Environmental Law. And then after Jane, we'll be hearing from Marce Gutiérrez-Graudiņš, who is founder and director of Azul. And so what I would like to do now is just move forward and introduce Jane. As Gabby said, if you have questions about the presentations, feel free to write them in the chat. We'll try to answer a few of the questions after Jane's presentation. If we get a ton of questions, we'll move ahead with Marce's presentation, and we can always circle back at the end to answer all of your questions. So here is Jane. Jane Patton is Center for International Environmental Law's campaign manager for plastics and petrochemicals. Her work focuses on policy and practice to eliminate pollution along the full life cycle of plastics and petrochemicals, with a focus on reducing harm and increasing justice. She has been co-coordinating the global civil society and stakeholder coalition that is weighing in on the international plastics policy conversation, which she does from her home in New Orleans, Louisiana. Take it away, Jane.
Thank you so much. And I am so glad to be here with you all today. I am going to share my screen, and I think you can see the slides. Chris, can you confirm that you are looking at the right view of the slides? Yes, okay, perfect. So as Chris said in my introduction, I'm with the Center for International Environmental Law. We have been one of the organizations really participating in, and I hope that I am saying with enough deference and respect, really facilitating and co-coordinating a lot of the civil society participation in the global treaty process. And we are really honored to be discussing this with you today. I have talked to the Waterkeeper Alliance before about this treaty, and we're now in a new place around it, and I'm really excited to be reporting on it. So before we dive into the specifics of the treaty, I am just going to give just a really brief overview and context setting around this. The picture you are looking at on this slide is actually a picture from a march that was held in 2020 before the pandemic. And even though there are folks in here wearing, in this photo wearing masks, because the people of South Louisiana, where I'm from and where I live, have been facing air pollution and unsafe air from petrochemicals and plastics production for many generations at this point. We are not alone in communities across the world who have faced ongoing health consequences and pollution, and frankly, systemic injustice along many dimensions, including and in particular race in the United States. We have faced these injustices and we have faced this pollution from the growing global threat of plastic production and use. And that is the lens through which we come at this work on the global treaty. And it is certainly the lens through which CIEL understands our advocacy and our work to change the law and improve and protect human rights in the face of the global plastics crisis, especially as it relates to the global climate crisis. So just to remind folks that plastics are fossil fuels. They are fossil fuels and chemicals. That is what makes plastics. 99% of plastics are made from oil and gas, from fossil fuels, which means the same companies that have caused the climate crisis are the companies that are causing the plastics crisis. If you even look at a little bitty snapshot with little bitty lettering about the global supply chain that goes into producing plastics, you are looking at crude oil and natural gas at the bottom, and you are looking at additives and plasticizers and chemicals. Many of the products that are in this supply chain, the component chemicals of plastics, are known human carcinogens. They are toxic and they have significant greenhouse gas emissions and footprints. And so the advocacy work that we've been doing with the coalition is very much in the setting of understanding that plastics as a crisis are not just about the accumulation of visible plastic waste in the environment, that they are also about the chemicals and fossil fuels, the air pollution and the climate emissions that go along with this supply chain. Now, plastics have been on the United Nations agenda for decades, right? Since the very beginning of currently the United Nations Environment Program, which was founded in about 1970, is usually the place through which conversations about plastics and the growing global plastics crisis are being had. The UN Environment Program has what's called the UN Environment Assembly, which is basically the legislative body of the UN Environment Program. It has actually only been meeting since 2014. Every country that is a member of the United Nations General Assembly is also a member of the United Nations Environment Program that's headquartered in Nairobi, which means they're also a welcome participant in the United Nations Environment Assembly. Obviously, member states choose whether or not to participate in the United Nations Environment Assemblies, but all members are welcome. Those assemblies are held in Nairobi. These days, they're also held in a hybrid format, both in person and virtually. And that is where policy responses to environmental concerns are addressed and negotiated. So since 2014, which was the very first, as I mentioned, UN Environment Assembly, the plastics have been on the agenda in one form of another. But for the most part, plastics have been framed as a litter and cleanup problem on the United Nations Environment Assembly agenda. And if we are looking at plastics as a problem that can just be cleaned up, as a problem that is just about visible, quote unquote, litter, either in the marine environment or in the land environment, we end up focusing a lot of our policy solutions on waste management. You know, it's about getting that visible plastic out of the environment more than it is about addressing the whole life cycle of plastics or about preventing the problem. Even to the point where I believe at the first United Nations Environment Assembly in 2014, the way plastics were talked about was as marine debris. And then the language progressed to being about marine litter, and then was about marine plastic litter. And we've now settled on understanding the problem as one of plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. So while we understand and are talking about policies that are inclusive of the full life cycle of plastics, we are still calling out that sort of understood to be special a problem of plastics in the marine environment, but that is actually only a small fraction of the problem. And as I said, plastics are made out of fossil fuels. They have significant toxic emissions and climate emissions, which means in order for us to meaningfully address the quote full life cycle of plastics, we really have to be looking at the entire life cycle of plastics. We have to be working to mitigate pollution in all of its forms, visible and invisible, toxic and annoying. And we have to be really looking at how those policy solutions are focused not just on waste management, but on waste prevention and also on the reduction of emissions and especially toxic pollution. So we have now at the United Nations started talking about a new global agreement on plastics. We're going to get into the timeline in just a minute, but coming out of the UNEA 5 meeting, which happened earlier this year, as I mentioned, it was in person and hybrid in Nairobi and online. More than 175 countries agreed to begin negotiation on a new global agreement on plastics. That follows a long line of global agreements that are also relevant to this plastics conversation because plastics touch on different elements of them, and also because the way that these treaties were negotiated will serve as models for how the plastics treaty gets negotiated. Those multilateral environmental agreements include the Basel Convention on the control of the transboundary movement of hazardous waste. That's really like the waste trade. Plastics obviously are traded as waste in recycling and trade systems. So the Basel Convention is actually already making some moves to be controlling plastics. Countries are now required to seek what's called prior informed consent. So if a company wants to, or a country wants to sell its plastic waste overseas, it has to make sure that the receiving country knows that it's selling plastic waste and that that is actually disclosed in formal trade disclosures. And so the Basel Convention is already taking steps. The Stockholm Convention, which is about the control of persistent organic pollutants, those chemical additives, is also taking steps that are relevant to the plastics conversation because a lot of plastics actually contain persistent organic pollutants. Plastics have also been on the agenda at the Global Climate Conference, that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which many of us refer to shorthand these days as the Paris Agreement, because of the significant climate footprint of plastics. They're on the agenda there, and climate is, at least among civil society organizations, on the agenda in the United Nations Environment Assembly conversation on plastics. Also relevant to this conversation is the Minamata Convention and the Montreal Protocol. Again, both of these conventions, the Minamata Convention is on mercury, and the Montreal Protocol is actually on CFCs, or the ozone precursors that were causing the hole in the ozone layer. While those two things are not typically directly related to plastics as an issue, the way that those two, the way that the Minamata Convention and the Montreal Protocol were both negotiated and were set up to solve the problems they sought out to address are serving as models for our conversation on the plastics agreement. And then, of course, the last one that's of relevance here is the Convention on Biological Diversity. Plastics are typically considered, plastics as part of a broader issue of pollution is considered, unfortunately, one of the three environmental crises that is being faced by the planet and humankind at this moment, that being those three crises being climate change, pollution, and the biodiversity loss. And so the Convention on Biological Diversity is obviously relevant to the plastic conversation, not just because it serves as a model for a multilateral environmental agreement and negotiation, but also because of the elevated importance of plastic pollution on the global environmental agenda. So let's look for a minute at the timeline of what we're looking at here. The timeline precisely has not actually been negotiated or set yet. There is a meeting that starts on Sunday that Marce and I are both participating in, which is what they call and I unfortunately misspelled it here, an OEWG, an open-ended working group meeting, which is where countries will actually come together to solidify and negotiate the schedule for intergovernmental negotiating committees. That's what INC stands for. And each of those meetings is a round of negotiations. So what we're looking at is that the treaty has to be fully negotiated by the end of 2024, and then it will be signed by countries in 2025. So we have to report progress back to the 6th UNEA meeting, which is end of February, beginning of March of 2024. So obviously there will be a round or two possibly of negotiation that will come later that year. And then the treaty is ideally going to be signed in 2025. So this is all coming up fairly quickly. And this is why we've been doing this outreach to civil society and nonprofit organizations around the world to engage folks on this conversation. And several of the members of our group, of our coalition, which at this point is over 100 organizations that are representative of more than 30 countries around the world, we have begun thinking on what a global agreement could look like. What do we want in a treaty? And what could it address on the plastics crisis? So there's sort of 4 key pillars, and quickly those key pillars are, we obviously want countries to be monitoring and reporting the problem, setting targets for reduction and prevention, making sure that there is transparency and disclosure. We want countries and regions to be working on plastic pollution prevention, which is about national action plans. It's about financing. And frankly, it's about reducing the amount of virgin plastics that are actually being produced. We obviously want the global treaty to be coordinating among the multilateral environmental agreements that I mentioned in the previous slide, but also things like the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, all of the relevant bodies that are addressing pollution and particularly marine and environmental pollution around the world. And of course, we want to make sure that the treaty has proper financial and technical support for all countries. If we're going to be innovating on new technologies and new structures in order to address the plastic pollution crisis, which we really do need to be doing, countries need to be financially supported in that, and we need to be sharing technical best practices across countries. Now, that doesn't happen organically. In order to get that global treaty, we actually have to be working at the national and regional level, and civil society in particular needs to be doing that work. So just as an overview of some of the work that's happening around things like zero waste markets, around things like bans on single use, around taxes on virgin plastic production and strengthening environmental justice, and really looking at the complicated puzzle of what regions like the European Union are doing in this holistic, comprehensive single-use plastic directive. These are representative of Rwanda, India, the United States, the European Union. We have several regions and countries that are taking significant steps that can serve as a model for how we both negotiate the plastics treaty and ensure that it has real ambition to solve the problem. One of the key sticking points on this as I close out is actually going to be that issue of reducing new plastics production, not just for the United States, but for a number of countries around the world. Just a relatively small handful of countries are plastics producers in the world. The United States is one of them. And there will be significant push from civil society to be looking at an actual measurable reduction in the amount of plastic that we produce each year. And part of why we need to be pushing for that so hard is because right now the amount of plastics that's produced every year is actually planned to go up, and not by a little, by a lot. We already produce over 400 million tons of plastics a year, and the industry is talking about upping that number by more than a third by 2025, which is only 3 years from now. So we really need to be pushing on countries to put hard limits on the amount of plastic, and new plastic in particular, that can be produced. Because we always say at Break Free from Plastic, if you want to stop plastic pollution, you have to turn off the tap by stop making plastic. And so that was a very quick overview of the technical side of how we envision the treaty and what it could possibly look like. And I want to hand it over to my colleague Marce at this point to really talk about what that delegate outreach and advocacy looks like at the United Nations. And actually, I'm not sure if I'm handing it back to Chris or directly to Marce.
I'll introduce Marce in just a minute. I didn't see any questions come up in the chat, but are there any questions directly for Jane before we move on to Marce's presentation? Domokos, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. My question would be, I'm from Europe, so we have like a lot of border regions. Do you have any addressed issues where the border crossing pollution of river is addressed in the negotiations or from your organization?
And just so I make sure I'm understanding you, you're asking particularly about plastics crossing borders through rivers?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So a lot of the conversation at the global policy level is really about this transboundary issue. I mean, that's part of why we've opened the global conversation about a new agreement. If this was an issue that was happening only domestically within countries, we would have less ground on which to actually negotiate a global agreement. But because plastics are transboundary, they cross borders through the ocean, through rivers. That is very clearly a significant part of the policy conversation. There have been projects to do things like talk about filtration systems and catching plastics and things like that. But that's also why we are pushing for more upstream solutions that are focused on eliminating the need for so much plastic and single use in the economy to begin with, in a way that then reduces the amount of especially post-consumer plastics that can end up in rivers. Rivers are obviously, because there's so much of the world population that lives on the banks of rivers and that is unfortunately experiencing injustice around riverine plastic pollution. That is very much a consistent and significant topic of conversation. And I think a lot of where we're pushing the conversation is on prevention in addition to cleanup.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah. I know I've seen a lot of pollution in our rivers in our area here. They're often dumping grounds for waste and things like that. Do we have any other questions before we move on? Earl? You're gonna have to unmute, I think. Yep.
Sorry about that. Are you looking at other ways of making plastics besides with petroleum so that it will be biodegradable?
Yes, there has been a lot of conversation of high level petroleum feedstock like corn or potato, or we've seen many different of chemical be put into those make the synthetic plastics that are still chemicals of concern, that are still carcinogenic. And just because you make plastics out of a food-based or natural material does not a lot of stock are not themselves. So very conscious about how we are really testing for and making sure that the plastics compostability standards, making sure that even when they're posted, that they are actually added, rather that they are being additive rather than, oh, I'm sorry.
I wish I could hear that response. Is there any way to get it in writing?
Yes, I did that. I'm sorry about my internet.
You came through perfectly during your presentation, and then it was just started cutting out a little bit.
Chris, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. And it looks like Jane might be typing a bit of a response there, so that would be great. And we'll move on to Marce's presentation, and we'll save space at the end for questions on both presentations. We are also very, very fortunate to have Marce Gutiérrez-Graudiņš, who is the founder and executive director of Azul, which works with Latinxes to protect coasts and oceans. Marce is an environmental justice advocate who began her career in the commercial fishing and aquaculture fields. She says that she used to sell fish and now she works to save them. She has helped design and implement a statewide network of marine protected areas and a sustainability program for California fisheries. She's a leader in the campaign to ban single-use plastics in California and has worked to reduce marine pollution and protect ocean wildlife. Recently, she participated in the first Congressional Roundtable on Environmental Justice on Capitol Hill. She's a founding member of the Latino Conservation Alliance, and she serves on the advisory board of the Ocean Foundation. She has been a speaker at Stanford University, University of California, Santa Barbara, UC Davis, the Explorers Club, and the UN in Geneva. She's a native of Tijuana, Mexico, and now makes her home in San Diego. Thanks so much for being with us, Marce. Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Buenos días. My name is Marcela Gutiérrez-Graudiņš. as mentioned. First, before I start on anything, I want to give a really big thanks because, and a big shout out to the folks at the California Coastkeeper Alliance and Orange County Coastkeeper, with whom I've had the pleasure and privilege to work for the last 6 years. Not sure if you've seen it coming out in the wire, but this 2 weeks ago, we had a major victory here in California where we managed to end for once and for all a large what we call boondoggle here, which is a bad deal for the public, bad deal for the environment of the Poseidon desal plant here in California. So that was exciting to work with our colleagues, Ray Heimstra and Gary and Sean Bothwell. So if any of them, you know them, big shout out to them. So thank you so much for having me here. I am going to share my, share this, let me see, share screen. Okay, got it. And I'm gonna go a little bit over the presentation that we had. I'm sorry, the report that we had. This is a very basic slides. What I will go ahead and send you after this is our 3-minute animation that you can have a better idea of all this summarized very nicely. So as you heard earlier before, we had the opportunity to be involved in this work actually through Jane's invitation initially. We were at this conference here in San Diego and talking about plastic pollution, or as we were talking about at the time, marine pollution. We are primarily an ocean conservation group. In environmental justice, we had seen this work. We started here in California, we've seen this work with the communities we work with, and we had seen polling, we had seen the problem, and so this is something kind of moved us to do this work. And at the same time, this is actually something that we see a lot in communities. So when we hear folks seek us out, folks look for us, it's because they saw something about plastic pollution. So it's something that people are very aware is happening. Obviously, it gets a lot of news attention, but we've noticed that this is something that moves people to take action. From, you know, doing what I can to actually like, hey, let me call somebody up, let me call a group, how do I take action, right? So that's exciting on that end. We were able to present at the International Marine Debris Conference at this session, actually Jane facilitated, and from there off we went to Geneva again through the facilitation and yeah, I don't know what the word is in English, of Jane, and from there we were asked to write this report. This is an important report at the time because it is the first time that the UN had actually acknowledged the specific link. Still, if you see it, we are talking, and this is about marine litter, plastic pollution. This is something that they had to approve. We did our best to try to expand the conversation within the bounds of actually having the UN UNEP publish a report for you. So obviously, just these are the constraints under which we're working. So the report objectives was the most important thing for us, knowing that there was this work and this framework of actually working towards a treaty, was to put something in people's hands that would be very helpful. We wanted something that would actually be a tool that people could use, not something that was just gonna, you know, be put in a drawer somewhere. And so that's where we started. So first of all, you know, Azul was the group that was invited to do the report. We wouldn't have been able to do it without Juliana Colillo, Stephanie Munguia, and Christopher Chin, which are our co-authors, if you see that. Also very important, this report is a literature review, and it's not the first time that this had been said. There's people on the ground, there's organizations on the ground that have been doing this for decades. And so, you know, really want to make sure that we don't pretend that this is the first time that this conversation has come to light. It was the first time that UNEP talked about it, and that's the importance, but not certainly the first time that folks have been doing it. In fact, we really depended and we relied on a lot of literature that folks have been producing, like CIEL or Tejas and Gaia, So very important to talk about that. We are seeing a very renewed, a brand new interest in environmental justice in the last couple of years. And as we go into that, it's really important that we talk about what environmental justice is. We really grappled around this, describing environmental justice for a global report, because there is a specific idea in the US, which is the environmental justice was born to right the wrongs that the mainstream environmental movement was not addressing or was creating, right? So it was a movement that wasn't really looking at communities of color at its inception, and it was leaving a lot of that out. And so that's a movement that came out to counter that. And so it's very important to understand that at the international global level, obviously there's different dynamics, and so there's different ideas. So what we came to was that environmental justice applied to communities that were not close to political power, economic power, and so defining that as the folks that are the most disenfranchised in that sense. So we wanted to, in this report, clarify those interlinkages. And the way that we agreed to do it with the UN, UNEP, was to see it through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if any of you have seen this, these are the 17 Millennium Sustainable Development Goals that talk about everything from gender equality to eradicating poverty to collaboration and industry. So this is something that we started out, and we assumed that there was, obviously there's goal 14, which is like below water. So we assumed there was going to be some of that, because coming from a ocean conservation standpoint. And we were surprised to see that basically there was a problem with plastic pollution that actually, if you looked at it in the proper context, there was a problem where plastic pollution impeded the timely achievement of all 17 goals. And that was even surprising for us. We wanted to have something, like I said, that was very actionable. And so we also have in this report recommendations from everything from industry to NGOs to international bodies, as well as countries and the public, into how to do this, right? Very important to note, we were asked to write this report in 2019 at the beginning. It was initially going to be a 6-month process. This is my first go around. I had no idea it was going to take. It took about 2.5 years. Obviously, in between that also, we are, struck by the pandemic, and we then had to go back and revisit and add a whole chapter around the impacts of the pandemic, obviously. So just so you know. So the report outlines, first of all, obviously the COVID, this surge that we saw in plastic pollution, and also things that we saw, for example, here in California. We had folks that frankly taken advantage of the situation, tried to repeal indefinitely laws that we had hard fought, like the plastic bag ban, and the which was then won a referendum. Obviously at the beginning, understand it's an emergency, we don't know what's going on, health first, but we did see after a fact folks that were trying to expand that into some sort of wholesale denial of any kind of those laws here in California. And very importantly, wanted to impact, and again, this is very important to say that we're not the first ones to talk about this, but wanted to really highlight, and I say plastic death cycle because I refuse to say life cycle, but the death cycle of how it actually impacts everybody, and from, as Jane talked about, extraction to waste to actual production. And this was very hard to do because, for example, since plastic is so widespread, it is very hard to find peer-reviewed scientific articles that are able to isolate plastic health effects in people, because there's so many places that we are all in contact with it that it's hard to study it in a very specific way. So we were forced to look at only production locations versus, you know, looking at finding those, especially longitudinal studies that would pass muster with the UNEP. The other thing that was very hard was, you know, there's not a lot of peer-reviewed science around the effects of plastic and all of its death cycle in marginalized and marginalized communities, right? So we had to find out, how are we going to come up with the sourcing on that? If there's not enough science, because we can talk about why there's not enough science around that, why folks are putting money into studying this versus that. We had to figure out ways to, you know, how are we going to adequately source this information? And we had to, you know, in certain places, like, okay, we're going to have X amount of news articles, and are we going to use blogs? How are we going to differentiate that? So that was a lot of the of setting up this report as well. And so I think Jane said it best, but you know, we have throughout this, the extraction, obviously, I was surprised. I knew about the issues, but I was surprised by how much the extraction is really driving, plastic is driving extraction of the raw materials. And one thing that we did see, and you can see in the report, is how, as the West and rather, you know, developed countries have started to move away from you know, certain fossil fuels, whether it's through daily use or through transportation, etc. There is an actual concerted effort by oil companies to replace this, obviously with plastics, as Jane said, but also geographically. So there's actual plans about, like, okay, well, now we're going to go to Latin America, and this is our next, now we're going to go to Asia or Africa, and this is where we're going to replace our losses in Europe and North America. So that was quite galling for us. The one thing that also was really interesting, so I grew up in Mexico, which to this day, you actually can't drink water out of the tap. And so there's a very obviously well-spread use of bottled water. Well, doing this work, we looked at the study that talked about, and it's actually conducted in Mexico, about how plastic bottled water. It's not necessarily just a solution, but in some cases is actually driving the problem, because governments, and this was a study in Aguascalientes, governments, you know, abdicate their responsibility of providing that potable water, because they're relying on the plastic bottled water. So it's not just a solution. And this is how I grew up hearing it. It's like, well, you know, you get the bottled water and that's safe water. But then we never talk about, well, hold on, why don't we have potable water out of the tap? What is stopping that? So there's a study, and he looked at the market forces versus, you know, places that had actually moved towards potable water. And what this study, which was fairly thought out study, looked at is, it is an application. So it's actually, you know, a solution search of a problem that continues to exacerbate the problem. Obviously, the one that I think that we all know the most is disposal and incineration. Again, this is where we started with disposal in the actual litter. I can tell you, again, I grew up here right on the border, and that's something that we saw to what Domicos was talking about. Like, this is something that we see here. We have the Tijuana River that goes into the Pacific Ocean, and we see this issue where there's booms and filtering, but there's nothing being done about, well, what's the actual solution long term, right? Are we just going to keep on holding this and not actually talking about how to reduce this issue? And so here you go. So we went through all the goals, and I'm going to go ahead and send you the video afterwards. But, you know, the things that really surprised us, for example, goal 5, gender equality. There's actually a gender dimension to this, because in a lot of countries, the folks that are actually sent out to do the waste picking are women. And on top of that, that's one situation. Also women, through obviously our hygiene and hygiene needs, we are exposed to more plastic throughout the month and throughout our lives, whether it's cosmetics or feminine hygiene, etc. So we're actually exposed to more plastic, and so that's a whole other problem there. Obviously, you know, what we're talking about, the clean water, is this actually a solution, or is it driving the problem? Decent work. I can tell you, I lived in Contra Costa, which is up here in the Bay Area next to the Chevron plant. And it's really interesting because people talk about like, well, this is Chevron town, and you know, people should be happy that there's that source of work because this is such a like depressed and economically depressed place. But what they don't talk about is that before the Chevron and the refinery showed up, there was other industries that eventually had to leave because it was too dangerous for them to be next to the Chevron plant. Right. So it's we need to start thinking and really like questioning how we ended up here, and not just trying to see like the output and how we define these problems in a very narrow way, usually to put the onus of the solutions and the onus of the problems on the people that had the least to do with it and the least political and economical power to actually change them. Right. So as you see here, we went through that, and I'll send you the report. As well, we reviewed the numbers. We looked at the recommendations. Obviously, there's the education and what can people do. Vote with your wallet. Talk to folks. I can tell you that folks call us all the time and said, "What can we do? What can I do to help with the plastic problem?" And obviously folks, the public, they really want something that's very easy. They want the one thing they can do. And yes, there's the stop using plastic yourself, but my whole thing is like, well, I'm going to give you two. And the second one is call your representative, right? That's the most important thing you can do. Call your representative, find out who it is, and talk about this being an issue to you. And so for us, the most important thing is advocacy. And so, you know, this was published last year. I can tell you a little bit about, let's see, I'm gonna stop sharing. About the process after that. I was very lucky to be in Nairobi and some of the other meetings with the coalition. I won't lie to you, it can be very nerve-wracking at the beginning. I will say it is a fairly collaborative, collegial, and yeah, it's a very collaborative group. There's a lot of opportunities to kind of like wade yourself in and not necessarily be dumped off the deep end. Don't worry, you don't just show up. Normally, you don't just show up for one meeting and then you're asked to write a report, unless you probably want to, and maybe you can make that happen. But it is a very exciting opportunity to work with folks around the world, do something very just very impactful. And there's, you know, there's guides and there's trainings and there's again sort of that group work that allows you to, you know, you can show up in Nairobi, or you can do it remotely, or you can help locally. There's that advocacy both at the local international level. So if you're on the fence about trying to join this, I would say please look into it. We need as many folks as possible. And it's really exciting, having been also at the climate COP and then seeing this from not the beginning, but from a much, you know, earlier place. It's just really empowering to be able to bring that experience there. And I think everybody should be involved in the measure that they are able to. And I think that's it for me.
Great. Thanks so much, Jane and Marce. And if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat or raise your hand, and we would love to continue the conversation. So we have a few more minutes here. Do we want to test Jane's internet connection to respond to Earl? I believe the question was on biodegradable plastics.
Yes,
Yeah,
and I did write something up quickly, but didn't want to interrupt Marce. So is it unstable again?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to say quickly, because I did put it in the chat, there are still a number of concerns associated with plastics that are made out of feedstocks that are not oil and gas. So if we're looking at even feedstocks that are, for instance, corn or potato or sugars, we're still looking at whether or not those plastics actually meet compostability requirements, because just because they're made out of an alternative feedstock does not mean they are biodegradable, and it does not mean they are compostable, which are two different things that have different definitions in different jurisdictions. We also want to make sure that even as plastics are compostable, that they are actually nutritive, that they are adding nutrients to the soil, which they're not automatically doing just because they are composting. And so what we advocate for through CIEL and a number of our partners, especially in the Break Free from Plastic movement, is really moving toward reuse and refill rather than looking for alternative forms of single use. And I'll also just say, we are facing a moment where we have a larger population than ever. We have to make sure we are feeding our people and making sure that people themselves are getting the nutrients they need. And I think the last good use for corn is to make plastics when it is itself food. And so I would definitely be pushing for us again to be using resources in a way that is really mindful and really very well within the planetary boundaries of what we have available to us.
Great. Yeah, there's a lot of information that is misleading around alternative plastics. Just putting the word compostable on something, as you mentioned, it doesn't mean it's biodegradable if it winds up in the ocean. Often it's not, and it won't compost in your backyard compost either. It needs a super high temperature industrial compost, which doesn't exist in a lot of communities. So those are all really good points. There was an earlier question from Abby on PHA as a substitute with the potential to eliminate negatives of plastic production. I don't know if that was included in your response.
I have to admit, Abby, that I am not a materials scientist. I know it will be shocking for folks to find that out. That what we do is really looking at the advocacy work that is looking at the problem as holistically as possible. So again, I'll go back to the fact that what we are trying to do is create a policy environment that allows for as much reuse and refill as possible, rather than looking at other forms of single use. There are going to be applications that it is impossible to get away from single use and away from synthetic polymers, but those should be addressed after we are actually addressing the vast majority of plastics, which are wildly unnecessary and are unjust in the way that they are being produced and used and disposed of. So we really want to keep the policy conversation at addressing what is the more urgent and pressing injustice and problem, and then look at how we can use applications like PHA for substitutes for the things that really can't be done away with. And I don't know, Marce, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah. This. No, sorry, I'm correct.
Great. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I did want to tee one up for either one of you that may want to take it, and that is, I often see a lot of conversation around the issue of recycling. And when people are discussing for instance, the ocean plastic pollution crisis, they immediately go to, we need to do more recycling. And to me, those are two very different issues. One is the transport of the waste, and the other is how the waste is processed. And specifically, some of the variation in materials makes recycling very difficult. I know some materials like number 5 and number 6 plastics are really not recyclable at all, yet we kind of go through the charade of doing that. So I was wondering if either of you could speak to that and how we're hoping that the treaty would address that.
Yes, I think the right word there is charade. Obviously, we now are understanding how this has been a concerted effort to pass this off as a solution. For us, and I have my little props here, for us, we've always really wanted to look at that culture of reuse and not so much consumption. So, I mean, when we were doing the bag ban here in California, people kept talking to us about like how, oh, you know, certain populations, they're too poor to care about this, or they don't know how to reduce, reuse, etc. And I mean, the racism and nonsense of that, but I literally had to go find one of my grandmother's bags and we made it our whole poster. This is like sort of like the bag that my grandmother used for generations, and you may not call it, you know, reuse. It's just common sense. And so we have to remember that plastics are very new and that it's not something that we have had forever. And we need to really move away from that inevitability of it. We have to really look past that. And like Jane said, yes, some things cannot be changed. I understand that. I also think that that's sort of like a red herring in the conversation to change the conversation, but there is so much that we can do before we move to that. For us, it's always going to be reuse and common sense, and that's where our community talks about this work. Jane?
Yeah, and to add on to that and also try to address Deanna's question in some of my answer here, y'all are going to hear increasingly buzzwords around the idea of the circular economy. You're going to hear about advanced recycling. Maybe you'll hear people talk about chemical recycling. The plastics industry is on a worldwide, but particularly US nationwide effort to expand the definition of recycling to include what is burning, combustion, energy intensive heating, and frankly, chemicals management of plastics as a form of waste management. That is also a charade. Chemical recycling, advanced recycling has never been proven to work at scale. It has never been proven to actually be economic or effective for communities. And it contains, it involves processes that have significant air pollution emission problems in addition to significant greenhouse gas emissions. So I just want to make sure that we are linking together the fact that mechanical recycling has never been an effective way to manage plastics. And it is increasingly ineffective as the pace of plastic production is wildly accelerated compared to the pace of recycling build out, management build out, even in the context of advanced recycling or chemical recycling under the banner of circular economy. We are still not seeing anywhere near the level of actual recycling happening or collection of plastics or frankly replacement of virgin resin with post-recycled resin on the level that would be needed in order for recycling to be in any way a viable response. I would say that it's not even a viable response for most of the plastics crisis, not least of which because, as Chris pointed out, there are a number of plastics that are in very common use that can't be recycled. PVC, polystyrene, you would be surprised. Polystyrene is not just foam. It is a lot of hard plastic containers that folks see every day. Even polypropylene, yogurt tubs and things like that is very largely not recycled, even in the United States. So we're seeing problems at its core with the recycling. To get to Deanna's question about health impacts, there are health impacts that are associated specifically when we pull the feedstocks for plastics out of the ground, whether it's oil or corn or potatoes. There are toxic air emissions of carcinogens, of dioxins that are associated with the refining of oil into a process that the feedstocks can then be used for plastics. The process of making plastics itself requires quite a lot of heat, quite a lot of water, quite a lot of air emissions. So the communities who are living alongside plastic production facilities are breathing in known carcinogens, things like benzene, things like dioxins, are permitted by local governments in the place where I live they are permitted to put these carcinogens into the air. And when we push back on the local government and say, please do not give these companies a license to dump cancer-causing agents into the air, we get accused of fear mongering. Well, you're just creating fear out of nothing because you're concerned that the children who live next to these facilities have chronic rates of asthma. They have weird skin conditions that people have never seen, right? So this is what we're talking about when we talk about health conditions, rare gastrointestinal diseases that affect, 1 out of millions, and yet half of this block has that, of this city block has that gastrointestinal problem. That's a real example from a city in South Louisiana that's living alongside a neoprene facility, which is a kind of polymer. So these are the kind of health impacts we're seeing from plastic production. And that doesn't even get into the conversation around BPA and phthalates and plasticizers that everyone is being exposed to, that have neurodevelopment, degenerative impacts. They have impacts on fertility and on development of babies in utero. They have all sorts of impacts on children and full-grown adults, up to and including cancer and different types of cancer. And that's, again, before we even get into this conversation about waste management and how living on and near piles of waste is toxic and mentally degrading and harmful. And so it is a human rights violation across the full death cycle, as Marce says. And so we have to be really clear about understanding what are the health impacts. I know a lot of folks in the United States, especially moms, I'm a mom to a 5-year-old, are concerned about BPA. We're concerned about the exposures of phthalates and plasticizers, but we also need to be concerned about the air pollution. We need to be concerned about where that waste is going when it's done and who besides our own children are being adversely affected and harmed, because there's lots of other babies and lots of other mamas and lots of other parents that are being hurt by this system. And we have to think about how we're lifting everybody out of that system of harm and making sure that we've made up for it.
Thank you for that. I'm glad this is being recorded. That is really good. And I think we'll have time for one more question, but before we do that, I know some people may have to jump at the top of the hour, so I just wanted to thank again our guests and also emphasize that this is ongoing work to pass this, this treaty. There's work to be done in every country. And at the local level as well. So please get in touch with Marce or Jane or myself if you want to get involved in the Plastics Treaty, because it is going to be a big push happening all over the world. Thank you, Jane. Just put her email in the chat. We'll also be sending a summary out to the attendees. And there's Marce's email as well. And we do have one more hand up, so I wanted to get over to Domokos. Go ahead, Domokos.
Yeah, thank you so much. I joined from Hungary. I'm the UN Youth Delegate of my country, and this is my connection to the topic because I'm visiting schools next to the river in my country, educating them, and also organizing the recycling system of the schools. So I wanted to comment on Marcella, who said that sometimes we learn from old people, and it's totally true that what I'm doing in the education is just bringing back what the parents or grandparents of the kids did. So yeah, that's why I'm not considering circular economy or those solutions as a new approach. They are like from old thing. And my question is, are your organization cooperating with young people in the organization itself, or young people participating in the UNEP process in Stockholm or somewhere? Because I will be there next week, and we have also a youth assembly for that with policy paper and side events and so on. So do you have any cooperation to those groups?
Yes, in short, is the short answer. So I will say that the Stockholm Plus 50 conference next week is happening at the same time as the open-ended working group meeting to set the schedule in terms of negotiation for the treaty. So I'm not participating in Stockholm Plus 50, and I assume Marce probably isn't either. But we are coordinating with the UN Environment Program's major group for children and youth. For those who are not deeply familiar with the UN Environment Program, all civil society stakeholders, and forgive me, it's lunchtime, so there's quite the conversation happening in the background. All civil society stakeholders are coordinated under a system that sort of divides up everybody into 9 major groups if you're not a government. And one of those major groups is children and youth. They are actually a significant portion of the coalition. We coordinate with members of that major group. We make sure that they review anything that we are putting out. We also coordinate with the women's major group and the laborers and workers and trade unions, farmers, local authorities. These are just examples of some of the major groups. So our coalition is built up and made up of groups that are really across the gamut and across the world. And most of the children and youth that we're coordinating with are actually in the global South. And one additional is that we work with IPEN, the International Pollutants Elimination Network, who have a significant membership in this global policy conversation. And they have a dedicated youth group that we are also closely coordinating with. And IPEN, of course, comes at this issue from a really chemicals focused and health focused lens.
And we're a very small group, but we have been collaborating in Mexico for the most part. We're seeing a significant interest from high school and college students, university students. So that has been happening here in Northern Mexico and Mexico City, but it's very exciting. There's obviously an oversized excitement of folks wanting to collaborate and participate. So it bodes well for us, I think, to have so many folks involved.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to the presenters. And I'll be sending out this recording for those who are still on the call along with some other information. So go and enjoy lunch for those whose lunchtime it is. And thank you again.
Thank you all for having
Thanks,
us.
everyone.
Gracias.